Father, we thank you so much for this opportunity to just look at the spiritual development of this faith we know as Judaism, faith and a cultural movement. And we know we share a common heritage, and so, Father, we're always interested to know your ways and how they're interpreted. And Father, most of all, we're aware that everybody is your creation. You are the creator of all people. And so, Father, in our desire to love one another, we need to understand one another and listen to one another. So our desire here tonight is just to listen, to hear another perspective, and to learn from that perspective, to warn us even of the dangers that can come from joining our faith to our culture to the extent that we get blinded to the truth. And so, Father, as we look back upon the history of a people treated not well by other nations and even by our own Christian tradition, we just ask that you would help clarify for us the lessons that we need to learn from the mistakes of the past so we don't repeat them. And Father, we ask this in the name of Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen. Well, hello everyone. We're going to pick up today with the last talk on Judaism. And we've worked our way through the first couple centuries here, and now we need to talk about the last kind of stretch. And even that's a rush to get through this in the brief 90 minutes that we have. But we want to talk about the development of Judaism from World War I to the present day. So again, it's more historic than philosophical and theoretical in terms of theology and Jewish practice. But I thought it might be helpful to review this, especially since there seems to be this interest among Christians to think about the role of Israel and its role in prophecy and so forth. And so whenever we go to dialogue about that and the reality of Israel, 1948, etc., we probably ought to know what we're talking about historically. So forgive me if this talk sounds a little bit like your high school history session. So we're going to have to tap back into our high school history a little bit and try to build on that. But it's important, I think, if we're going to dialogue about Zionism and Israel, that we know a little bit historically about what took place there. And so we're going to go back through some of those historical facts. So again, we'll kind of do the talk, and then after the talk, we'll take questions at the end. So before we get into World War I and the session for this week, there are a few slides left over from last week, and it's appropriate that we look at them this week because they kind of set the table for what we're going to talk about in terms of World War I, World War II, etc. And this has to do with the idea of Zionism. You remember, as we left the story somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, we were talking about how Judaism now had various traditions as a part of the overall movement. You had Reform Judaism, you had Orthodox Judaism, you had Conservative Judaism, you had Reconstructionist Judaism. There were many schools around here as the 1800s and into the early 1900s. And all these different schools were seeking to explain how do we deal with the realities of the modern world and yet remain faithful to our culture and our heritage of being Jewish. And some of these had religious tones to them, and others of them had more political and cultural tones to them, or some mixture of the two. And so what we find there is this struggle that happens in all religious circles when you get into this modern period. To what degree, on the one hand, do you assimilate with the local culture in which you find yourself? And to what degree do you kind of dig into the tradition and background to make sure that you stay faithful to your original tradition? So you have like the two tensions of fitting in and blending in on one side and digging in on the other. And so where do you fit somewhere in the middle? Well, we're going to see that those tendencies, both of them, kind of emerge in this movement called Zionism. And so we're going to look at that. And again, I put a source there. I'm borrowing an outline here, kind of, sort of, and so I just want to acknowledge that. where does that term come from, Zionism? Where do you kind of see it first expressed in its academic setting? Well, it's this fellow, Nathan Birnbaum. As a young student, he creates this journal called Self-Emancipation, and he just talks about this need for Jewish people to now begin to assert the need for a Jewish state or a Jewish homeland. And so he began to kind of argue for this in this college newspaper journal that he started. Later, he will actually push back and reject the whole idea of political Zionism. But just so you know where the term came from, it came from him, even though he kind of later changed his views as he grew. The real kind of founder, if you will, of Zionism is Theodor Herzl. Now, what we're going to see as we talk about Zionism is we're going to say it's not one thing. It's not a monolithic thing. Not everybody's in agreement about what Zionism is. There's different schools or philosophies about what Zionism is. And one of those schools is political Zionism. This was the school that said we need our own state. We need our own government. And so Herzl was the one that started that. He is born in Pest or Budapest, Hungary, and then studied in Vienna. He was one of these assimilation guys. He was one of those ones that said you should blend in for the early part of his life. You remember we talked about that Jewish movement known as the Haskalah. It's the enlightened ones that were trying to show that Judaism could be a part of the modern society. They could blend in with the new learning. They blended their Jewish tradition with the new modern learning. Herzl was not necessarily a devout or practicing Jewish person. He was more of a cultural Jewish person. He argued that we should just stake our place, stay where we are in our societies, where we are, and just show that we as Jewish people can be full citizens in the country in which we live. However, as he was a student, came out of going to school in Vienna, he got a job working for a newspaper and went to Paris, and there he covered the Dreyfus Affair. Now, some of you, if you rack your brains back to your high school days, you can remember talking about the Dreyfus Affair. It was the affair of a captain, 1890s, 1894, I think, the affair of a Jewish captain that was accused of selling military secrets to the Germans. And there was this kind of makeshift trial, and he was condemned. And in the process of this trial, there was a great deal of anti-Semitism that was expressed in the newspapers in Paris. And Herzl is there watching this unfold, all this anti-Semitism, and he is beginning to wonder, are we ever going to be treated as full citizens in the country in which we live? I mean, it's so unfair. And as it turns out, and we can't get into a lot of detail here, if you know the story of how the Dreyfus Affair goes, they eventually find the guy that actually was the spy, but they kind of gave him a slap on the wrist, and Dreyfus was convicted. Later, he was retried and convicted again, but pardoned, and it wasn't until later, 1906 or so, where they finally rehabilitated him and put him back in the army, but never fully admitted they were wrong. In fact, it was, I think, the mid-90s till the French government, the French army actually admitted they had made a mistake. So it was a terrible injustice that was done. But in the midst of it, there was this virulent anti-Semitism that served at the root of this. And so Herzl watched all this, and through that process became convinced that we are never going to be treated fairly in these other countries. It's just not possible. And so he publishes this kind of manifesto, if you will, of political Zionism, translated The State of the Jews. And this becomes a document where he just lays out and he makes the case that at this point, the only possible answer to this problem is to set up a new state for the Jewish people to live in. The preference is obviously the land of Israel, now called Palestine. That's the preference, but he was willing to consider options. There were options on the table for a while, for example, to create a Jewish state in Uganda, and that was discussed and debated. But he came to this position that in order for there to be for Jewish people to really be able to practice their culture, practice their business, that you need a state run and governed by Jewish people. And so he writes this manifesto, follows up by putting together this organization, the first Zionist Congress that becomes the Zionist organization, eventually the World Zionist Organization. And that organization begins to actively campaign with various governments to establish a Jewish homeland ruled by Jewish people so that the Jewish people can have their own government and be treated fairly. So I thought it might be interesting to look at a couple of the quotes that come from Herzl's book on the Jewish state. This quote says, "Everything tends, in fact, to one and the same conclusion, which is clearly enunciated in that classic Berlin phrase, out with the Jews." In other words, that was the answer to, in some of these cultures, they came to this conclusion, look, we just want the Jews out of here. We don't want them in our culture. We don't want them in our country. He's sensing that in all these Eastern European countries, even Western European countries. There's that culture that says, look, they are the problem for our society. There's this anti-Semitism that we've been tracing all the way through the history of the Western world. And so there's this culture that says, out with the Jews. And Herzl is saying, you know what? I think they're right. The only way we're ever going to be free is if we get out and have our own place. And that's kind of the essence of his work, the Jewish state. And then he makes this statement, "I shall now put the question in the briefest possible form. Are we to get out now, and where to? Or may we yet remain, and how long?" In other words, there are these two tensions. Do we continue to stay in the countries and cities where we live and continue to try to make this argument that we can be Jewish and live in these other cultures, or do we just have to get out and establish our own country and our own homeland? Now, what's interesting here is that word question, and this is going to be a problematic phrase that reoccurs in this period and later periods, the Jewish question. These days, if you're from a Jewish background, you hear that, the Jewish question, and it puts a little twinge in your ear because it has to do with this anti-Semitic position. There's a Jewish question, really? Whether Jewish people can live here or there, and here's the Jewish person himself saying that, unfortunately, is the dilemma we face. And you're going to see why it's even more controversial than that as we go along. But this is Herzl himself kind of introducing this question. What do we do about the Jewish people that live in our communities? His recommendation is we need to get out. Look at his other quote here. This is kind of the close of his treatise, and it's this inspirational thought. He says, "Therefore I believe that a wondrous generation of Jews will spring into existence. The Maccabeans will rise again, that group that pushed back against foreign rule. We're going to rise again." He says, "Let me repeat once more my opening words. The Jews who wish for a state will have it." He's convinced that this must happen. He's going to invest his money. He's going to invest his time. He's going to devote the rest of his life to make sure the Jewish people have a state. He says, "We shall live at last as free men on our own soil and die peacefully in our own homes. The world will be freed by our liberty, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness, and whatever we attempt there to accomplish for our own welfare will react powerfully and beneficially for the good of humanity." That was his philosophy. That was belief. And so Herzl, for the rest of his life, pushes and goes to all kinds of political means to get this agenda put forward. And so this political answer to the question, what we need is a Jewish homeland run by Jewish people. Now, it's interesting to note, this form of Judaism, there's no religiosity here. This is not about faith. This is not about the Bible. This is not about the Tanakh and the prophets. For Herzl, this is strictly a cultural Zionism. This is, we need a fair place to live. We need a place where we can practice our traditions, where we're not discriminated against. That's the only answer here that where we're actually going to be left alone. So that's kind of the founder of Zionism, if you will, comes from that perspective. Now, that was one group. There was another group that was a little less bold about it. They're called practical Zionists. And again, there's multiple people here, and I picked kind of a primary spokesperson for each of these movements just to give you a flavor of what was going on here. kind of the representative of practical Zionism is a guy by the name of Leon Pinsker. Now, Pinsker, again, he's one of these Eastern European guys, again, believed in assimilation, believed we could just kind of work in our culture, we could raise up and be a citizen in our culture and be respected. But again, after the Odessa pogrom, where the persecution of the Jewish folks in Russia there, he kind of came to the same conclusion that Herzl did. We've got to get out. I mean, this is not going to work. We've got to have our own Jewish homeland. And so he organizes this group called the Lovers of Zion, and he publishes this work called Auto-Emancipation, which basically means self-emancipation. And so his argument is that the Israelites or the Jewish people are going to have to take the initiative. They're going to have to want to be free. See, it turns out that not everybody had come to this conclusion. There were many Jewish folks in this particular field that still felt they needed to stay where they were. This should not be a political solution. This should be a cultural or a religious solution. And so there were folks pushing back on the whole idea of Zionists. Not every Jewish person in this day and age was Zionist. And so he argues strongly that it's the Jewish people themselves that must want this freedom. They must come together. And so his practical Zionism, as opposed to the political Zionism that was kind of going out in front and rushing ahead and trying to make deals and making this state come into being, Pinsker says, no, it's going to be a slower process than that. It's going to have to take time. It might not be a state. It might be some sort of organized territory where we can have somewhat authority. This may be a process over time that we're going to have to work through. But it's a slower, more cultural values kind of thing that has to happen over time. So this rush to get a political state is going to end up backfiring in his mind. And so we've got to be a little more practical and realistic about how long it's going to take for us to get to that place of freedom and emancipation. Yes, we still need a land of Israel. We'll still need a Jewish homeland, but maybe not so quickly. We should work this slowly. And so, again, we'll look at a couple quotes from his work to get the flavor. I mean, he's a brilliant writer, wonderful turn of phrase here. Notice this quote I thought was kind of compelling. He says, "We must prove that the misfortunes of the Jews are due above all to their lack of desire for national independence, and that this desire must be awakened and maintained in time if they do not wish to be subjugated forever to disgraceful existence. In a word, we must prove that they must become a nation." Again, talking to the Jewish people, saying, look, we've got an internal job to do. We've got to convince the majority of Jewish people that they've got to want this state. We've got to go through that process, as long as difficult as that might be. Here's another quote from Pinsker. He says, "Judeophobia, which is this fear of the Jewish people, is a psychic aberration." This idea that there's something psychologically wrong with people, that they have this Judeophobia. As a psychic aberration, it is hereditary, and as a disease transmitted for 2,000 years, it is incurable. So he believes there's something fundamentally wrong that's been passed down from generation that have created this Judaic phobia that is at the basis of this anti-Semitism. So this is like an incurable social disease. So he's saying, look, this is not going to get fixed. This is not going to go away. You can't continue to exist as a Jewish person in Russia or in Poland and still survive all this, because you're fighting against a psychological aberration that's been baked into a culture for generation after generation. So that's why he's saying we need to convince our fellow brothers, Jewish brothers and sisters, that this is not going to go away. We've got to live up to this. We've got to realize that this is going to happen. And so he says, to sum up then, and this is just an example of his brilliant use of language, he says, to sum up then, to the living, the Jew is a corpse, to the native, a foreigner, to the homesteader, a vagrant, to the proprietary, a beggar, to the poor, an exploiter, and a millionaire, to the patriot, a man without a country, for all a hated rival. He's saying no matter what we do, we're misunderstood. That's just a social disease that's out there. And so we're not going to be able to fight this any other way, but eventually coming to the conclusion that we need our own homeland. And so then he makes this statement: the only solution is in the creation of a Jewish nationality, of a people living upon its own soil, the auto-emancipation of the Jews, their return to the ranks of nations by the acquisition of a Jewish homeland. That he's very clear and explicit. Now, I included this quote because notice the opening language there. The only solution. And so now we have this phraseology being introduced into the culture, which is later going to take this terrible turn. What is the solution to the Jewish question? It's a horrible phrase after time, but it's introduced in this whole discussion of Zionism. Because they're looking, what is the solution to the Jewish question? The Jewish question, where do we live? How do we continue to be Jewish? And here's Jewish people themselves saying, well, we have to come up with a solution to that question. Later twisted by the Nazi machine, but that's kind of where some of this language originates. And then to continue that thought, he said, the international Jewish question must have a national solution. Of course, our national regeneration can only proceed slowly. We must take the first step. Our descendants must follow us at a measured and not at an over-precipitant speed. In other words, let's not move too fast on this. Herzl was like, we're doing this. Before I die, we're having a new state. I'm going to find a new nation. Generations from now, people are going to remember me and say, yes, that was the guy that did it. I mean, he was a man with a destiny. He had a vision. Before he died, this was going to happen. Where Pinsker is saying, let's just take it easy here. Because if we go too fast it's going to be an artificial solution to this problem, and it's not going to last beyond the next generation. We need to move slow, and there has to be a cultural transformation among the Jewish people themselves to realize this is the only way forward, to have our own nation. There's another version of this, another type of Zionism called spiritual and cultural Zionism. And Ginsburg, the pen name Ginsburg, he's the guy that kind of is generally regarded as the father of this particular school. Again, an Eastern European, watched the pogroms, the persecution of Jewish people in Russia, and what now is the Ukraine, and again feels this need to, we've got to do something here to change things. Although he takes a slightly different approach to all this. He gets involved in the political movement, the practical movement. I mean, he doesn't distance himself, but eventually he comes to the conviction that there's some problems with this political agenda, that we can't just go into this nation and create a new state of Israel. That's not going to work right away. It's not going to be that easy. We're not going to be able to impose our will on the Arabs that are there, the British that are there, the other, we're not going to be able to just go in there and do that. This is not going to be a simple solution. You guys are being very idealistic about the ability to deliver a Jewish state. I mean, it's not going to happen. And by the way, if you just go in and create a country or a state with the vestiges and the machinery of a state, that's not going to solve the problem if there's not a cultural renaissance that goes along with that. We've got to embrace Judaism as a spiritual, cultural center. Otherwise, the state by itself is not going to solve the problem. His view is that part of the reasons for the problems Judaism is facing and the need to go forward, while they do need a homeland and while they need some sort of center and focus, what they really need is a cultural, traditional, spiritual rebirth. Now, you have to embrace modern learning. You have to embrace all the new sciences. You have to do that. But what you can't do is abandon your Jewishness. There has to be a cultural center to all this that you have to work along this. So what he was arguing for is before you create this state and just rush to create a political organization, maybe you create spiritual centers and traditional centers in Israel and begin to build up the culture of Judaism in the land of Israel before you try to force a state into existence. So another version, kind of a modified version of Zionism going on at the time. Notice, to this point, we still don't have anybody talking about the prophets. Nobody really seeing this as a genuine religious thing. This is a practical answer to a very practical problem. How do we create space for Jewish people to live out their culture and their heritage? Well, that's addressed somewhat by this other type of Zionism, religious Zionism, and Raines is kind of seen as the person that pushes this one. His argument is that, look guys, unless we tie this to our religious tradition and our religious background, the state we create is not really going to help. There's got to be a religious piece to this. We've got to recover the traditions of Judaism, the religious traditions, the rabbinic traditions. We've got to build that in. And so we've got to merge contemporary learning, yes, science, yes, enlightenment, yes, but we've got to merge that with traditional Jewish thinking and learning. That this ought to be a preservation of the whole Jewish tradition in this new land. It can't just be a political, cultural answer. There's got to be a renaissance and a rebirth of Jewish religiosity if we're going to be a successful state in the New World. So another wing called religious Zionism. And as if you didn't have enough versions of Zionism, there's, of course, labor Zionism. And this Naaman Sirkin, who is the kind of seen as the father of this movement. Remember, this is the time of Marx. This is the thinking in terms of new economic equality. And so, of course, you have one school of Zionism that says, look, if we're going to have a new state, it can't be a capitalistic state where we have rich and poor, because that's not going to work. It's going to destroy the Jewish people. If we're going to have a new Jewish homeland, it should be based upon Marxian principles, so that there's equality of the poor and the rich. And so let's not organize it as a capitalistic state. Let's organize it as more of a, shall we say, unofficial, not officially, but more of a communal, shall we say, government. And so you have that party saying this is Zionism. And then there's yet another form of Zionism. They're called revisionist Zionism. And this particular version of Zionism is led by this individual called Ze'ev Jabotinsky. And what he was about was we've got to be militant about getting into Israel. Look, the only way we're going to be able to take this is by push it. We're willing to take up arms. We're willing to do whatever we have to do to create the state of Israel. We will be politically and militarily engaged. We are not going to take no for an answer. They are either going to give us a state or we'll die in our way. So that's the kind of the old zealot mentality. We're going to do this. And as a matter of fact, he does lead several paramilitary organizations that fought all the way through up into World War I, World War II. He has these movements that are pushing. He actually, in World War I, he puts together a whole Jewish military legion that goes into battle and helps to fight in World War I. So here's another whole version of Zionism. So again, as we've noticed over and over again, there are many different approaches. There's not one Judaism and there's not one Zionism. There's multiple flavors of Zionism here, all contending for different levels of, yes, we need a Jewish state, or we need at least a Jewish homeland, or we need a Jewish cultural center or something. Now remember, these are the folks that believed in Zionism. There's another whole group of Judaism that still hasn't been convinced that they should be a Zionist people. Remember, we talked about Hasidism last time, and the Hasids were like, no, we don't need that. That's the wrong answer. How could you build a Jewish state? We need to wait for the Messiah. You can't force the Messiah. You can't force a Jewish state. You can't force the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God will come when God wants to bring the kingdom of God. So the solution you're proposing is you're forcing the hand of God by building this political machine. So more of the Orthodox tradition is saying, no, we don't need Zionism. We don't want Zionism. It smacks of humanitarian and human intervention to create a state. We've got to wait for God to do this. And so we have this deep conflict and divide among Judaism itself about whether we should have a land, a new kingdom. And if so, what should that land look like? What should that state look like? What should that homeland look like? So multiple schools, multiple beliefs. Well, into all this mix and all these reflections and all these decisions, we enter into World War I. And so we're going to switch to this session so you can switch over to your new handout. And this is going to put a whole new twist on this whole idea of Zionism and what are we going to do. Because World War I, most people are aware that World War II had a devastating effect on Judaism with the Holocaust and 6 million Jews dying. I mean, we get the story about World War II, but most people, or a lot of people, don't understand how devastating World War I was to Judaism. So we want to look at that, and then we will take a look at the Holocaust, way too briefly for my taste, but it is what it is. And then we'll try to touch briefly on the restoration of Israel and where we are. We'll see how far we get in the talk before we have to bring it to a close. But we do want to look at World War I because, again, a lot of things changed in terms of the worldwide Jewish population as a result of World War I. Now, I don't mean to stretch your high school history memories, all right? But just to refresh everybody's mind about World War I don't mean to insult our intelligence here, but I know at my age it helps to be a reminder from time to time. The whole issue behind World War I is it's precipitated, or at least it's kicked off when the Archduke of Austria is killed. And it's this battle between the National Serbs and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And so there is now this internal rivalry between the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and these nationalistic Serbs. It's kind of an internal civil war that's brewing and had been brewing for some time. Well, what has happened in the meantime in preparation for this is each of the two sides had developed alliances with countries around it. So the Austrian-Hungarian Empire had its rivalry and its mutual defense pact with Germany. Meanwhile, the nationalistic Serbs had a mutual defense pact with Russia. And so when the two countries then attacked one another, when the Archduke is destroyed or assassinated, there's this internal argument that goes on, and to make a very long story and complicated story short, that internal kind of political strife between the empire and the Serbs brings Germany and Russia into this conflict. And so now what was a local struggle and a local civil war now becomes a worldwide war, which was going to be the war that ends all wars, but we know how that worked out. A bloody war, trench warfare, many, many, many deaths. So that's kind of the big picture. Now, how does that impact Judaism? Well, let's look. The problem is here that when these two countries began to fight, when Germany and Russia began to go into their war, there were Jews left on both sides of the aisle. There were Jewish people living in Russia. There were Jewish people living in Germany. There were Jewish people living in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And then as the war went on, different areas got conquered and occupied by the other force, and there were Jewish people living there. And so Jewish people were left often trying to decide who to support. I mean, who do you, if you're a Russian and you're living in Russia, do you support the Russian government? If you're living in Germany, do you support the German government? And then what happens when the other group comes in and takes over? Do you switch allegiances? So there is this tremendous identity crisis that goes on among the Jewish people as they live in these different countries that are fighting one another. And then the leadership in the particular area in which you're living changes all the time because of the different groups taking over each other's territory. And so the Jewish people are left in this horrible position of who to support. And anti-Semitism being what it is, they get accused on all sides of being unfaithful to the country in which they're living. And so most notably, the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, decides to accuse the Jewish people in his land of being unfaithful to the Russian cause. He deports them off the Russian line of the war, and all of a sudden 600,000 or so Jewish people are forced to migrate somewhere else. Well, of course, when this happens, you have a whole myriad of Jewish people outside of the war theater. They're saying, wow, this is not right. The Russian people are not treating the Jewish people well. Maybe we should side with the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary and against Russia, because Russia is being so horrible to the Jewish people. And so you have a movement for a while for Jewish people to think, well, maybe we should favor the German side. But then in Germany, you have 100,000 Jewish people participating in the German army, fighting for Germany in this war, and yet in Germany, they're being accused of not being faithful to the German cause, of being traitors. And so, again, this horrible, messed up situation in which Jewish people find themselves. No matter how hard they support the country in which they're in, they're accused of not being supportive. And so there's just this huge mess of which side should we be on, and which side should the international Jewish community support? They're put in this identity crisis. And just to kind of make this point, it's Herman Cohen, if you know his work, he was kind of this guy that pushed this, writes this famous article called Germanness and Jewishness. He's making this argument that Jews should regard themselves as, the Jews that are living in Germany should regard themselves as Germans, and they should fight on the side of Germans against these terrible Russian oppressors that are destroying the Jewish nation. So you have Jewish leadership, some Jewish leadership, arguing you should be faithful to Germany. Then, as if all this was not complicated enough, we have the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, 1917, where the Tsar is taken captive. He and his family are killed, and now the Bolsheviks are running Russia. They withdraw from the war, just as the U.S. is getting in, incidentally. And now we have this whole new definition of the Jewish people in Russia. How do we relate to this new government? Do we participate in this Bolshevik revolution? Are we all equal citizens here? Now, this is supposedly theoretical communism, right? We're all supposed to have a vote. We're all supposed to be able to be part of the solution. We should be part of the government here. We should participate in this revolution. But it turns out after a little bit of time in this new experiment of the new Russian order, they have no intention of letting the Jewish people participate on this national level. It's now the Jewish people realize, well, apparently we're not going to be cut into this deal either. And so now they're pushing back against the Bolsheviks. And so again, just this huge mess of who to support and how to support, and push back and forth, and being driven from their homes, and accused of anti-Semitism, and rounded up and arrested for treason left and right. I mean, just a disaster. Well, in the midst of all this crisis, Britain is drawn into the war. And they're realizing that in order to win this war, they're going to have to get the U.S. involved. They're going to have to solicit support from the West. And so they go through a number of policy decisions about how to do this. And one of the realities that they come upon is that we ought to get the Jewish people united on the Allied forces side. In other words, we have to get the Jewish people united on the Allied forces side. Instead of supporting the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, we have to somehow, the Hungarians, we're going to have to somehow change the tide. So they're not supporting the Russian, or they're not supporting that side, they're supporting the Allies, which is very hard to do because of all the atrocities that Russia had committed. And so one of the ways to do that and to get the Jewish people committed was to negotiate what's been called the Balfour Declaration. And Balfour, Lord Balfour was the foreign secretary. He was kind of the one given this task to write this letter to Rothschild. And in it, it outlines a policy that Britain was thinking about adopting. And so this was published and put out there. And basically it was a declaration that the British government was now ready to support a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. I mean, they came right out and said this explicitly. And so for the first time, you have Britain saying out loud that it wants to establish a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. Now, they weren't clear about whether that was supposed to be a Jewish state, but they did say they wanted them to have a Jewish homeland. And they also were very clear that non-Jews would be welcome to live there, and it would have to be fair. But at least now you have the British government saying, we are now in support of establishing a homeland for the Jewish people, on record. And so this Balfour Declaration kind of becomes a factor in now the global Jewish population saying, okay, we need to get on the side of the Allies. And so with U.S. getting into the picture too, the American Jewish population, which was rather large at that time already, the idea was they could be supportive. And so when the Jewish people got on board, now remember, one of the reasons why they were arguing for this had to do with mercantile interests, merchants, chemicals, acetone that they needed for the war machine, financing that they needed for the war machine. And so there was this need to get Jewish people involved economically into the situation and help them in the Allied effort. And so the Balfour Declaration, if you go through and read it, I mean, it's easily available on the net. There's kind of like 9 reasons that are laid out there as to why they would get engaged in this. I think it's 9. And so you'll have to kind of see that on your own. But it's a tremendously important shift. Now, all this leads then to, at the conclusion of the war, and we don't have time to really get into how this ends, how the war ends and all that. But you remember one of the outcomes of World War I was the establishment of the League of Nations. And in all the long treaty that was put together to end World War I, there was this agreement that the area of Palestine was going to now be assigned to the British to manage and govern. It's called the British Mandate. And so they were given the task to manage this land and to give the Jewish people a homeland. And so on the books, this seemed like a good idea. That now the British people were in charge of the land of Israel, and they were under obligation from the League of Nations, from the Treaty of Versailles that ended this thing, to now establish a Jewish homeland in Israel. Except for, and this gave the Zionists, finally, they got what they wanted. They're finally going to get their homeland. They're very excited and very happy. It turns out they were a bit premature in their optimism, as we will see, but this was at least a sign of hope. So that is a very, very brief, unbearably painful brief comment on how World War I affected the Jewish people. Now, unfortunately, the way things were worked out at the end of World War I were very devastating, had very devastating results. In hindsight, which is always easy, right? In hindsight, a lot of bad decisions were made in how this thing got divvied up. They took the German-Hungarian Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and divided it up in all kinds of segments and sections. Capitals were sometimes out of the country where they were capital of. I mean, just all kinds of messy stuff. Just lines drawn and all kinds. I mean, you had lines drawn for people and half the population didn't even live there. I mean, it was a disaster. And it created this huge cultural melting or boiling pot in Eastern Europe. I mean, it was just one civil unrest after another, just repeating. And the onerous debts and the responsibilities that were placed on Germany to repay debts and all this kind of stuff, it wasn't practical and it wasn't realistic, and it was so punitive that it really put Germany in this no-win situation for a very long period of time. And we won't get into all that history, but it wasn't long then before the war to end all wars re-erupted, and we had World War II, and the Nazis were on the march to get themselves what was called the Lebensraum, the air to breathe. And so they attacked Poland and so forth. So now, we're going to be able to walk through all of these, the whole World War II history. So we're going to concentrate in how this Nazi regime sought to deal with what we see, the Jewish question. What's their solution to this Jewish question, which is the terrible, terrible tale of the Holocaust. So let me just spend some time, and let me just apologize in advance. I feel so ill-equipped to deal with such a sensitive and deep subject, but alas, we do have to kind of touch on some points. So let me apologize in advance for an inefficient and insufficient discussion of such a terrible time, but we'll at least try to cover some highlights. I do give you a note there. I'm borrowing this part of the outline from a Jewish scholar by the name of Henry Abramson. He has some great videos out there on YouTube. So if you don't want to listen to me and you want to listen to somebody who really knows what they're talking about, go get him, Henry Abramson. He has whole kinds of YouTube videos out there that are just awesome, explaining this history. So I borrowed his outline and tweaked it a lot, but at least I borrowed the general outline from him. So let me urge you to go out and check out his videos. They're awesome. Maybe start with a couple definitions. This word Holocaust, where does it come from? It's a strange word. It's an English word, Holocaust, that comes from the French, who borrowed it from the Latins, who took it from the Greeks. I mean, it has a long heritage, right? You saw my big fat Greek wedding. It's all about the Greek word, right? Everything comes from the Greek word, right? So it really comes Greek word. Let's talk about a whole burnt. That's what we're talking about, burning whole. And that Greek word is actually meant to be a translation of the Hebrew for a burnt offering. I mean, that's you see that in kind of the Septuagint Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. It talks about a whole burnt offering. And so for that reason, for Jewish folks, the word Holocaust is kind of I mean, it sounds like it's some sort of like somehow the Jewish people were offerings and God, there's sweet-smelling incense to God. I mean, it's not a good religious word. Now, obviously, Jewish people use that word Holocaust because that's the traditional use. But it has unfortunate moorings in a Hebrew culture or a Jewish culture that obviously it's not the best. But that's the word that was picked and used and stuck. And I wish I could tell you where it originated and all that, but I don't know off the top of my head who was the first to use it and so forth. But obviously that's the term that's used. Some of the Jewish folks, when they talk about it, and what they would prefer is to talk about the Shoah. It's a Hebrew word. It just means Shoah, meaning the catastrophe. I mean, it was just the catastrophe. In fact, I think, what's today? The 4th, I think the 5th is actually called Yom HaShoah. It's the day of remembrance of the Holocaust. And so tomorrow across the nation, and I think maybe even in Portsmouth they had it a week earlier or something, but across the nation, or across the world actually, there is this Yom HaShoah, the day of remembrance, where we remember the catastrophe. And it's just the loss of 6 million Jewish people through the course of World War II. Just a horrible, horrible thing. And I apologize up front, but I don't apologize. I mean, there's some terrible pictures, horrific pictures in this presentation, but part of the reason we have to look at them is to remember that we should never repeat this again. We should never let this happen again. So I put them in, as gruesome as they are, just to remind us that this should never happen again. And I warned you earlier this problem of this use of the language of the Jewish question and the solution to the Jewish question. This is why that phrase is so problematic and so offensive to Jewish people when you use that phrase, the solution to the Jewish question in our day and age, post-Nazism, because of this doctrine called the final solution of the Jewish question. And it is the Nazi policy of systematic genocide. In other words, their answer to the Jewish question of what to do with the Jews is to simply wipe them out, to destroy them. So that's why we have to be very careful about using that phrase, solution to the Jewish question, because, I mean, after Nazism, it refers to this plan of Germany to wipe out the Jewish nation, the systematic genocide of them. So, just to phrase it. So, if we have to focus on what are the different phases, if you will, of the extermination of Jews in World War II, there's kind of three different phases this thing goes through, and all kinds of iterations in between, but just to kind of stop at three places and observe. The first huge pogrom attack was this Kristallnacht, and it was it kind of is this phenomenon that started locally and just spread all over Europe like overnight, just before the outbreak of the war. And I mean, on the surface, it's this assassination of a German diplomat by a German-born Polish Jewish person, and the press the rumors got a hold of this, and it got put out all over the French area, and then throughout the rest, this one rumor got thrown around, and then there was this organized, systematic plan to wipe out just this tremendous amount of terror all across major cities all across Germany and all across Eastern Europe, that there was this coordinated night where they would just destroy Jewish synagogues and Jewish people. And so I give you a picture there of the synagogue in Berlin that was smashed, but in that one night period, this systematic kind of coordinated effort, paramilitary or organized, 1,000 synagogues, 7,000 businesses destroyed. I think I put some numbers here. Yeah, like 30,000 arrested, put in camps, contained. I mean, it was just a horrible night of pogrom, just culminating this against the Jewish people, showing that even after World War I, after all the settling, there's all this anti-Semitism that was still boiled in. So all this oppression that was happening in Eastern Europe and in Germany, because at the end of World War I, there was all this tension left and this economic disaster because of the oppressiveness of the Treaty of Versailles, that was just blamed on the Jewish people. I mean, and they were just the victims of more anti-Semitism. And this kind of erupted and came to this head in Kristallnacht in 1938. Well, the next stage of violence against Jews during World War II and the Holocaust is these groups called the Einsatzgruppen. And these are paramilitary, again, groups that were put together in Nazi Germany. This is kind of the first stage. And these groups would just go into the ghettos, the Jewish ghettos, and just start rounding up people, German units, and then later into Ukraine and other places. And when they would just round up Jewish people and take them out in the fields and shoot them. I mean, just en masse. And just horrible things. And sometimes, in fact, at this next picture, you can see they're actually made to dig their own graves. And they dig these graves, and then they just shoot them and put them in those graves. And just horrible, horrible, horrible stuff. Families, children, everything. Just round them up, shoot them, put them in a grave. I mean, it's just mass terror and just horrible stuff. And when they went in after the war and after some of these Eastern Bloc countries were after the communist regimes broke down and people were able to get into some of these archives and some of these libraries, they just found picture after picture of just horrible stuff going on with these Einsatzgruppen, and just many, many families lost there. And then, of course, what perhaps most people know more about are these concentration camps and extermination camps that were put together. What the concentration camps at first were just places where they would round up Jewish people from these ghettos and other places and just put them in camps to put them in one place. And of course, they were horrible conditions, horrible sanitary conditions. They were basically left there to die. I mean, they were just not given food. They were not given medical treatment. They were just grouped and put there to die. And all kinds of horrible experiments performed on them. I mean, they round them up, take anything they had of any value, including gold teeth and glasses and just tattoos cut off their arms. I mean, just horrible stuff that they would collect. And then just ship them off to these concentration camps, basically to be left alone to die. I mean, it was just horrible, horrible stuff. But then after a period of time, this thing got ratcheted up to not just concentration camps, but they started instituting extermination camps. And they started to bring in these gas chambers and these chemical gas chambers to be brought in to actually exterminate them. Apparently, the Jewish people weren't dying fast enough in this concentration regime, so they wanted to rush it along, especially as it looked like the war was coming to an end and the tide began to turn. There was more of a desire to kill off Jews faster, and so they established these death camps throughout the area. And this map kind of shows you a little bit where the concentration camps are, the death camps. And just to give you a rough idea of the different death camps that were out there, you can see a list, the number of people killed. And again, these are approximations. I mean, how do you really know? But sometimes the German camps kept better records than others as to how many. But it's just atrocious numbers. Just when you think about all this death, I mean, to 6 million Jewish people through this, it's just unthinkable. So, and in case you haven't seen a layout, I mean, this is just an overview of a United States overflight, and just kind of took a picture. I mean, they had these things all organized and laid out in nice square. I mean, it's just spooky. And then if you look here, I think it would be, let's see, it must be your right. There is where you can see some labels there, and as this gets blown up, you can see kind of where the gas chambers are. Sometimes there's 1 or 2 or 3 of these in these camps, and it was just horrible stuff. I mean, they'd be taken in these showers. They were told they were being taken to showers, and there were gas chambers where they would be put to death. I mean, it's just horrible stuff. Here you see a picture of children just being taken. I mean, it wasn't even just, I mean, children are lined up and taken to these extermination camps. A lot of times people weren't, and you can see here, I think the picture here is a lot of times they weren't even, they just got off the train, all their stuff taken, and almost right off the train, they're just marched right over to the gas chamber and put to death. So just a very brief oversight of some very, very terrible things happening. And then just a last word here. If you've never been down to Boston, next time you go to Boston, stop at the Holocaust Memorial down there by Faneuil Hall. You just walk down there and just stop there for a while, because one of the realities, especially considering the fact that Yom HaShoah is tomorrow, it's this idea of never forget. I mean, this concept that Christians and everybody else stood by while this happened. Now, it was not as if there weren't people that objected. There were. But we have to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again, that we don't allow the wholesale execution of another religion just because it's not our religion. I mean, it's just wrong. And so that's why it's important that we never forget. So that also is a hopelessly brief outlines, but just to give you a feel for the level of devastation that happened during the Holocaust. So you can see then by the end of World War II, there is this huge decimation of the Jewish people. The other problem you have is at the end of the war, where these death camps and these concentration camps were at last torn down, you have this huge problem of now displaced persons. Where are the the Jewish people that managed to survive, where are they going to live? Where are they going to move back to? In the devastation of World War II, they no longer had their homes, they no longer had their lands, they no longer had their money. Where were they? You created this huge refugee crisis all across Eastern Europe and Western Europe. I mean, there is nowhere for these folks to go. And so now that World War II is over, you have a whole new impetus to rethink and rediscuss the issue of Zionism. What are we going to do with all this huge refugee crisis we have? Should we reintroduce and reconstitute the idea of the state of Israel as a homeland for these folks to go to? Now, you remember where we left the problem. It was at the end of World War I, 1922, with the British Mandate, where now the British are given this charge to make sure that there is a Jewish homeland. So that's where we pick up the story again. And we'll talk a little bit about the restoration of Israel with the time we have left. I said that when they first instituted this idea of a British mandate, there was some hope among the Zionists of different stripes that maybe now this would be a time that we could have a Jewish people and a Jewish homeland. But it turns out that the British were very quick to change course in this British mandate. They were getting a lot of pressure from the Arab states that are there. And so shortly in the midst of the war, while everything else was falling apart, as the led up to the war, the Arabs were in revolt. They demanded independence from the British, leading up to World War II. And so the British mandate, the British were trying to control an Arab population that demanded, they were tired of the British rule over them and what they perceived to be a pro-Jewish stance and a promise to the Jewish folks to give them a Jewish state. There was a massive Arab revolt against the British there in just leading up to the war. And so Britain's sitting here dealing with this situation while they're getting bombed from Nazis. Shortly thereafter, the Blitzkrieg starts and the air raids over London and all this stuff. And so they come out of World War II ready to make a deal with the Arabs, ready to bring some kind of peace. They were tired of dealing with the British mandate. They wanted to deal with it in a way that would accommodate the Arabs as well as the Jewish people. But so they're trying to work some kind of deal that the Jews and the Arabs could get along in Palestine. And also, part of the problem is that at the bottom of this Palestine area is the Suez Canal, and the British really needed access to that Suez Canal and the goods that could come up through there into the Mediterranean. That was in their interest as well. And so they really needed to achieve some sort of peace. And so they kind of came out with this new policy called the White Paper of 1939. It's a proposal, if you will, of how to rethink the British mandate. And so this proposal called for a Jewish homeland within 10 years, which was not fast enough for some, but the idea that we should move toward a Jewish homeland. Now notice this is not a Jewish state. This is a Jewish homeland where Jewish people could live, right? So it was not going to be a Jewish state against some of the Zionists' hope. And we weren't going to have a partitioned Israel, that is a split between partially Jewish, they would have their autonomous region, and Arabs would have their autonomous region. So this policy kind of did a reverse on the Balfour Declaration, and they said, no, you know what, we're not going to have a Jewish state or a partition. We will give you a homeland, but it's not going to be your own state, and it's not going to be your own self-governed area. Moreover, it'll take us 10 years to get there. On top of that, we're going to cap it at 75,000 Jewish people. We're not going to allow more than that here because, again, they were getting pressure from the Arab side. And if there were going to be further Jewish immigration into the Palestine area, that would have to get approved by the Arab majority. So, and in the meantime, there was restrictions as far as what the Jewish people could buy and so forth. That was going to be their new policy leading into the war. Well, as you might imagine, this policy created a great deal of tension among the Zionists. And going in World War II, they felt sold out by the British going into World War II. And so there's all kinds of pressure on Britain from the Jewish population living there throughout World War II because of this policy that was they viewed to be pro-Arab and anti-Jewish. And so there's all kinds of issues created during the war and then after the war with regard to this immigration policy, letting Jewish people coming to the homeland. So what began to happen is that there were groups in Israel that began to take matters into their own hands. And so they started to raise up, I think it was some 64 boats that over a period of time began to bring Jewish people into Palestine. And there's this movement, Aliyah Bet. In other words, it was the immigration B. Immigration A was the legal immigration of the 75,000. Immigration B was kind of the technically illegal, but they felt morally justified process of Jewish immigration into Israel. And so they just, courageous folks, the revisionists and others, just started bringing Jewish people into Britain all the way through the war, and then after the war, bringing in the refugees from various parts of the country, just bringing them into Israel without British approval, without sanction. They just did it, and they kept bringing more and more Jewish people into the area. Estimates vary as to how many. It's all over the map. I put a number of 110,000. It may have been more, may have been less, but many, many people coming in. And unfortunately, the way the British dealt with this, as countries often do when they deal with this, quote, illegal immigration problem, they create internment camps in various places, Cyprus one of them, and just sent massive numbers of Jewish people to these places, which was just horrible, horrible optics, because these people just came out of concentration camps. They're coming to Israel. Now they're getting put into new camps by the British. I mean, it was horrible, horrible stuff. So it's just really bad optics there. So, but the Jewish folks these groups were still leading massive immigration efforts to just push pressure on the Jewish people, on the British government, both during the war and after the war. And then, as if things weren't worse enough, in 1946, at the end of the war, again, because of this massive displacement and massive economic problems that are caused in Eastern Central Europe at the end of World War II, there's more pogroms. I mean, there's just more anti-Semitism, blaming the Jews that are left for some of the programs that are going on. In this case, it was a really weird thing here happening, where there's this unfound allegation of this man that took this Jewish or this Gentile child captive, and the local town turned on the Jewish home, and there were these refugees living there, and they accused this man from this refugee house of taking this child, and this huge attack went on this home, and 40-some people killed. Violence, street riots broke up, and it spread again throughout. I mean, just another one of those horrible things that happened, and it just created another whole flux of Jewish people all throughout Eastern Europe saying, we need to move, we need to get to this homeland. And so the pressure now on the pressure on the British government to do something about this huge immigration refugee issue that was happening just put more and more pressure. So from the white paper then, there's this battle that goes on. We go through the end of World War II, and coming out of World War II, the United Nations now has to deal with this massive refugee problem, the ongoing violence in Palestine, and so they put forward a partition plan in 1947. This is different than anything that happened in the British mandate. The idea, and remember now, this British mandate had a sunset. It was due to expire in May of 1948. And so as that sunset was coming about, there were plans, we've got to deal with this because when the British Mandate ends, if we don't deal with this, there's going to be a crisis. And so the United Nations takes on itself to talk about what's going to happen in 1948 when the British Mandate expires. And so they developed this plan for a divided state, partly to be ruled by Israel, the Jewish people, partly to be ruled by Arab lands. Jerusalem would be split, and there would be run by an international committee, so neither the Arabs nor the Jewish people would have exclusive rule over Jerusalem. That would be ruled by a combined group. The UN General Assembly approves this plan. They think it's great, but it never gets acted on. I mean, neither the country, Britain, nobody really acts on it to implement it. In fact, what happens is they allow the British Mandate to expire. I mean, all attempts to negotiate a deal between the Jewish organizations and the Arab organizations fall through. It never happens. And so, on May 15th, the British Mandate expires. What's going to happen? And there were various organizations from both groups, the Jewish group and the Arab group. And what happens, just in one of the boldest moves you'll ever see, the Jewish People's Conference in just acts. And on May the 14th, I said May the 15th. I'm sorry, it was May the 14th. On May the 14th, when it expires, the Jewish People's Conference, sometimes the JNC it's called, they just proclaim. David Ben-Gurion just goes into the museum in Israel and just declares an independence, that we are now a Jewish state. I mean, he just says it. This committee says, and this is an organization that had been working with with the British government to negotiate laws, to negotiate social issues, to negotiate with the Arabs. I mean, they had a quasi-official recognition anyway to be the voice and spokespeople or spokesman for the Jewish people. It's kind of a conglomerate of organizations. And this Jewish People's Conference or Council had this kind of quasi-authoritative kind of position as the spokespeople for the Jewish community there. And then when the British Mandate expires, the Jewish People's Conference just declares itself to be a state. And it just did that. Now, they also had negotiated ahead of time that they were going to do that, and they communicated. And what happened is that as soon as they declared themselves a state, the United States recognized this state. And a couple days later, Russia, USSR by this point, recognizes their statehood. So now, voila, you have a new state of Israel, that simply. I mean, all that battle, all that debate, all that negotiation, all that planning, it was just the crisis at hand. The British Mandate expires, and the Jewish People's Conference says, we're a state. United States said, yep, we acknowledge that. USSR says, yep, we acknowledge that. And overnight now, or within a few days, you now have a new state of Israel. That's how quickly it happens. Well, needless to say, that was a bit of a shock to some people. And so, as soon as that happens, you begin the first of several Arab-Israeli wars that were to follow. Because, needless to say, the Arab Council was not happy about the way this went down. And so they started right from the beginning to push back, and the surrounding nations began to push as well. Syria, Jordan, these other, Lebanon, they began to push, saying, wait a minute, we never agreed to this. And so you start this first war. And so what happens as a result of this first kind of squabble is we get a negotiation. And so Israel begins to negotiate with its surrounding nations, and they kind of define the first level of where these lines can be drawn. And so we have this green line that's established in 49 to show the first definition of where Israel is. And Britain finally steps forward. They recognize now the new state of Israel. They release the various Jewish people that interred throughout the land. And in 49, finally they're admitted to the UN. So the UN recognizes Israel as a state. So just two important leaders that in all this, there are many we could list. I just highlight two. David Ben-Gurion is that guy who just led that whole process and declared his independence, the first prime minister of Israel, and then you have the famous Golda Meir, who eventually becomes prime minister, but she's active in this whole negotiation. One of my favorite stories is how when the first Arab-Israeli war breaks out, she comes into the United States and she talks to the Jewish group in the United States, and she tells them boldly that it's not their decision as to whether they go to war or not. That decision's already been taken. What she tells the Jews living in America is, your decision is whether we will win. We need your money. You don't decide whether we fight, you decide whether we win. So it's a very powerful statement, and she earned a lot of financial support from the Jewish folks living in America supporting this campaign in Israel. So, very powerful woman. So, that's where we stand at the end of 1949. Now, Israel is a state recognized by the major powers. You can go through and look. There's all kinds of debate as to when different countries are going to recognize and so forth. We'll have to let that slide. The next big movement in terms of the land possessed by and governed by Israel is in 1956, where you began this battle over the Sinai Peninsula, where Moses was and all this, and the children of Israel wander in the desert and so forth. There's this ongoing struggle, and it's mostly with Egypt at this point, because Egypt and the Sinai, they're arguing over the Sinai, and it has a lot to do with the Suez Canal and the trade that is now coming in from the east and the west up through the Suez Canal into this area. And so there's this ongoing battle between Egypt and Israel about who has rights to the Suez Canal and the straits that come off of it, the extent to which Britain can use that and the other European nations can use it. So there's this ongoing battle about who owns the Suez Canal. And so there's this fight over the Sinai campaign about it. So what happens in this Sinai campaign of 56 is Israel just complains that Egypt is now violating the terms of the earlier armistice. And so they go in, and supported by Britain and France, they take the Sinai Peninsula. And as a result of the armistice at the end of that struggle, they withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula, but they hold on to certain rights with regard to the Suez Canal. So it's kind of a start, but not totally settled, because 11 years later, we have another war over that same area, the Six-Day War in 67, where again it's this fight over the Sinai Peninsula, who has rights to the Suez Canal. And the difference is this time, though, Egypt pulls Lebanon and Syria, or Jordan and Syria, into the war. And so if you look here, it's not just about the Sinai Peninsula. Up north, you have the West Bank area, where Israel has moved into, and you have the Golan Heights. So the West Bank was run by Jordan, and the Golan Heights was ruled by Syria. And so in this particular movement, because of the incursion of those countries and their siding with Egypt, Israel just went and took all of it. They took the Sinai Peninsula, they took the West Bank, and they took the Golan Heights. They just took them. And so at the end of the conclusion of the Six-Day War, they were now a bigger country as a result of that struggle. So that's kind of the boundaries, more or less, as you see them. Now, that hostilities resume. We won't go into this with this Yom Kippur War in 1973. I'm looking at the time and realize we can't spend a lot of time here. But again, there's this coordinated attack again between Egypt and Jordan and Syria, and so that struggle continues. Part of that peace treaty that was worked out, you remember the good old days of Jimmy Carter? Part of the way this whole crisis gets resolved is through the Camp David Accords in 78. And it's important because it's one of those first attempts to get the Arabs and the Jewish folks to agree. And so we have Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat to kind of come together and at least agree on how we're going to deal with the Suez Canal and the Sinai Peninsula. So an important framework there in 1978. After this exchange, you have a new character entering the struggle, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and they're going to start to fight over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And so in 1988, now 40 years after Israel declares itself a state, the PLO declares themselves they're a government in exile. They declare Palestine to be a state, and they're the government in exile. And so that begins a series of wars with the PLO as to whether the West Bank and Gaza will now be the new Palestine. And so we have a number of skirmishes and arguments going over with the PLO now about those two territories. And those try to get solved in another set of accords, the Oslo Accords. And you may remember another Democratic president, Bill Clinton, presiding over, again, Menachem Begin, and this time Yasser Arafat, who's in charge of the PLO. They come to an agreement about the cessation of hostilities between the PLO and Israel, which, again, marginally successful, but at least it was a step in some sort of direction. So you have struggles with Egypt over the Sinai. You have struggles with Jordan on the West Bank. You have struggles with Syria and the Golan Heights. Now you have struggle with PLO internally. So you can see how the struggles with these other groups are growing and growing. And then jump ahead to 2006, and now you have another problem. You got Lebanon entering the war. In the northern area, there's this militaristic zone, demilitarized zone, this buffer zone, security zone, that Israel has imposed with Lebanon. But now that gets broken. And you now have a new enemy called the Hezbollah, who are now coming out of Lebanon attacking the north. And so a new battle is launched. The wars continue with Hezbollah. Now you also have Hamas getting involved, another organization, terrorist organization, that's trying to take over the Gaza Strip, which is down in that western southern group. And so you can see, I'm just rambling through these at a very fast rate, but what I'm trying to show you is look at all the enemies that get pushed in from all the sides, from Egypt to Jordan to Syria to Lebanon to internal struggles with PLO, with Hezbollah, with Hamas. I mean, this has not been an easy ride. So those early Zionists that said, look, this is not going to be easy, turns out they were a bit of prophets themselves. It's not easy. This is not going to go well. And so the problems continue right into our own day. Last couple slides here. You've heard of the Iron Dome 2011, the security that Israel has placed over to detect these rockets and intercept them and shoot them out of the air. And working very successfully. We have friends living in Israel, and they will tell us of when this gets engaged. It's an amazing, amazing defensive mechanism. And ongoing struggles in terrorism. Now the problem is just all these organizations coming in, ISIS, ISIL, Hamas continuing. I just took this out of the paper the other day. Hamas putting out a statement. They're bragging that this month has been the best month of terrorism since one stabbing every 2 days. So they're claiming that. So, I mean, the struggles continue, the terrorism continues. So all that to say, the evolution of Judaism from the early days of rabbinic thought, where we're talking about oral Torah, written Torah, how far have we come? Now we're dealing with the issues of state and a totally different view. And so all I would ask you as you think about Judaism now as we move forward, to not think of it as one monolithic thing. Obviously, we have seen all kinds of traditions, all sorts of beliefs, all sorts of positions. Let's just be respectful of that as we dialogue with them and listen as we engage with them as Christians. Let's just close with a word of prayer. Father, we're just so appreciative of all the work that's been done over the years to document this history so that we can come along and just see the story, see it unfold, see it manifest itself to us with some degree of of clarity so we can see how you have been working among your people, how your people have been wrestling with your will, and how we as Christians can come alongside as forces of good and forces of right and forces of truth to follow our Lord, who tells us that this is not about picking up a sword, but it's about truth and justice and support and love and prayer, believing that your kingdom is not of this world, but is an eternal kingdom for all eternity. And so, Father, as we seek to be members with a foot in both camps, in this earth where there are all kinds of nations warring, but also our heart being in the kingdom of heaven, that we are about being your people, and we want to follow faithfully, and we want to be representatives of your way and your truth in the midst of this cacophony and in the midst of this confusion, in the midst of this hatred. We want to be voices of rationality, voices of hope, voices of your kingdom and your gospel. And we ask this in Christ's name. Amen.